right, welcome back. So the topic for this mini lecture is civil rights in America till 1955. Particularly, we are going to focus on the African American experience during this time. And we're going to talk about five broad things that you need to think about, that you need to keep in perspective when you start to research and study this very complex and very involved topic. The first of these, Plessy versus Ferguson and Jim Crow. All right? So the treatment of African American individuals throughout much of America's 20th century was predicated on these things. And the first, Plessy versus Ferguson, was a Supreme Court case in the 1890s. If you've ever heard of the phrase separate but equal and wondered where it came from legally, this is where it came from. This was a court case that had stated that it was okay to separate individuals on the basis of race, so long as the facilities or conditions under which they were being segregated were equal. Now, obviously, states and local institutions decided to drop that part, and they maintained a rigid white supremacist social and cultural structure throughout, again, much of the 20th century. They did so through a series of federal, state, and local laws, codes, both formal and informal, and this, of course, was known as the system of Jim Crow. Now, this had come from an earlier minstrel term in the first half of the 19th century, but by the early 20th century, again, meant a complex system of legal segregation of individuals on the basis of race, but also informal enforcement of other forms of segregation. And this, of course, could include a great deal of violence. Now, something else for us to note with Jim Crow, we tend, if we are from, say, the Midwest or the East Coast, to think of it solely as something being in the American South. That is, of course, not the case. It existed nationally, because racism is not, sadly, bounded by geography. Now, secondly, World War I and World War II. All right, so African Americans are going to serve their country honorably, and they're going to do it by the tens of thousands across a number of different roles in the First World War and the Second World War. They're going to have both positive and negative experiences as they deploy all over the world. Many of them will go to countries, though, that will have better laws and treatment as it goes to individuals who are not white. And in some cases, in many cases, they will feel not only that those countries are a bit more welcoming, at least in certain circumstances. So, for example, Paris was perhaps more welcoming than the rest of France, right? That idea. When those soldiers return home, they will feel a certain element of having done their duty, having done a sense of service, and that the country should perhaps support them as a result of that. Now, of course, they will be denied, because of those cases. Thirdly, many movements. All right, we tend often in the K through 12 arena to talk about the American civil rights structures as if it's one singular movement in one time, one place, one part of the country, and for one group of individuals. We tend to think it's singularly focused on African Americans. We tend to think it's singularly focused on 1955 to 1965. We tend to think it is singularly focused in places like Alabama and Mississippi. None of those are true. Many individuals sought rights across the American story, issues having to do with race and gender, but specifically for African Americans, when we're talking about the idea of civil rights struggles, we need to understand that it is many movements, if we're looking just even in the 20th century. And we need to also make sure that we understand that it is also occurring all over the country. The South gets the biggest focus, obviously, but it occurs nationwide. All right. Fourth, women. We don't do enough to understand and to account for the role that African American women played in bringing the rights struggles of the 1950s and 60s, the ones we tend to focus on, to the forefront. And this is partly because of the nature of the violence associated with Jim Crow and maintaining white supremacy, and much of that was sexual violence against black women. And we need to acknowledge that further. Fifth, Brown versus Board. Now, there are two Brown versus Board of Education cases in the 1950s. But the big thing that comes out of Brown versus Board is that it overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. That's one. And the second is it states that segregation must be ended, that all of this needs to be ended with all deliberate speed. Yeah, I know. I'm not sure what the specific date for that is either, which of course is going to create some serious issues with desegregation in the 1950s and 60s. All right, thanks so much.